This is Focus on Africa from BBC World News. I'm Sophie Ikenye. Our top stories. All smiles as the Africa-China summit wraps up in Beijing. The continent's leaders head home with the promises of investment and loans. A community in shock after a massive explosion at a Cape Town munitions factory leaves 8 dead. Re-elected last month, Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta is sworn in as Mali's president, but the opposition is still disputing the result. Also in the program, it's not just sequins and pom-poms. We meet the cheerleading team from Lagos who want it recognized as a sport. And in sports, Gabon international Mario Lemina gets the UK's highest ever fine for a motoring offence. Thanks for joining us on Focus on Africa from BBC World News. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa says political leaders have agreed to work hard to increase Africa's value-added exports to China. Now, he was speaking at the end of a summit in Beijing where $60 billion in additional loans and aid was announced by China for Africa. And with it, a promise of no strings attached. Well, it all sounds great, but critics fear it could lead or load developing nations with too much debt. Stephen McDonald is in Beijing.
The China-Africa summit has wrapped up. So what are we left with as most of the delegations head home? Well, President Xi Jinping says that his country will import more from Africa, especially in terms of products which are not natural resources, that there'll be enhanced cooperation in the transport and energy areas, and that his country will invest more in projects protecting Africa's environment, especially those dealing with climate change. But many analysts will see this as all too general as to be easily quantified in terms of whether or not this will genuinely affect Africa. Sure, the $60 billion in extra aid and loans to Africa is not nothing, but even this has been criticised. It's said that those African countries which can't make the repayments will be locked into China's sphere of influence. And yet, everybody sent representatives, and only a handful of African countries didn't send their head of state. So it's difficult to escape the conclusion that what we're seeing here is a major geopolitical shift, and one that's happening before our very eyes.
Well, that was Stephen McDonald in Beijing. Well, let's bring in Tony Watima. He's an economist in Nairobi. Thanks for taking time to talk to us. We're talking about $60 billion in loans and aid. But I wonder whether these developing countries can actually make the repayments, given that some of them are actually in danger of defaulting on other loans.
Yeah, that's the biggest question that many people have asked. We talk about quite a number of countries are in economic distress or are heading to economic distress. The 60 billion fund that China is bringing brings another dimension of whether these countries can be sustainable to be able to repay these loans. Now, the biggest question is that China has been promising quite a number of these funds, but in terms of countries meeting those, countries receiving those amounts, there have been quite some red tape in terms of the requirements that you access these loans. So that's another question. Even if it's promised, we are yet to see even the previous funds that countries benefited much out of those loans that were promised. I
wonder though then whether the continent has a clear strategy on how to use these funds for their development.
Not so far. No, there is no plan. Because countries are negotiating bilaterally as individual countries. We don't see that countries negotiating as regional blocs in terms of infrastructure projects that are doing within the region. If countries will negotiate as regional blocs, they will have a better standing in terms of negotiations with China. But we are yet to see that because countries are negotiating as individuals, and it brings another dimension on how cost-effective it is, whether you negotiate as a region or whether you negotiate as individual countries. All
right, Tony, the Chinese president talked about no strings attached. Is there really anything like that when it comes to investment?
that statement is specifically on political interference. And we've seen the Chinese model has been that. There's been little interference, political interference within African countries where they conduct business. Now, that is true because that has been their model. The question is that in terms of political interference, you need democratic accountability, you need democratic stability in order for these countries to prosper, even if they are to pay the loans back. Now, China will at some point have to step in, because we saw this with South Sudan. They were part of the negotiations in terms of the peace treaty. And so it's something that they might postpone for now, but it's something that is dire, that is needed in the country, especially looking at how countries are degenerating in terms of democratic accountability.
All right, very briefly, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has just gone back home to find some problem in his own country. The country is, the economy is now in recession. How will they bounce back, do you think? Very briefly.
The technical thing about the recession in South Africa is that agricultural sector hasn't performed as expected. That's the biggest hit for the economy. We can see that it might rebound, but the question is that about South Africa is that the social injustice question about land appropriation laws. It creates an uncertainty within the market that they will have to navigate in terms of boosting investor confidence to South Africa.
All right, Tony Watema in Nairobi, thank you for taking time to talk to us here on Focus on Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Now, an investigation is underway after an explosion at a munitions factory near Cape Town in South Africa, which left 8 people dead. Much of the building was destroyed in the blast that also rocked nearby homes. Well, let's go straight to our correspondent, Nomsa Maseko, who is in Johannesburg. Nomsa, what is the company saying about this explosion?
Well, the company expressed shock and said it was saddened by what has happened. It also says that this is not the first time that such a blast has occurred. In just the last 10 years, it has recorded about 3 incidents, but also says that this one is the most devastating one. It also says it's still investigating the cause of the blast.
Well, there was a government minister who visited the place today. What does the government intend to do now?
Indeed, there were several government ministers who visited the site. They also said that they want to offer and provide support to families of those who lost their relatives. And also they are saying that it could take a while before an investigation is concluded, but we understand that many more other government ministers will come out, to go and visit the site after the Deputy President, David Mabuza, called for this, investigation to be a top priority investigation.
And so how is the community dealing with this tragedy?
It's quite somber, it's quite devastated for such a small community to be experiencing such an incident. In fact, community members went to the factory today to offer support to the relatives of those who lost their loved ones, and also, held some prayer meetings. In fact, there were some 2 stories that came out. One was that of a 21-year-old who died in the blast, who was actually meant to be resigning and start his job as a police officer, and the other who'd been working for the company for the last 21 years, and his wife refuses to accept that her husband has died.
Yeah, quite a tragic story there. Nomsa Maseko, thank you for that update. Thank you. Well, let's now take a look at other stories making the headlines across Africa and the rest of the world. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the opposition MLC party has warned a court decision to ban its candidate Jean-Pierre Bemba from running in December's elections will drag the country into chaos. Now, Mr. Bemba, a former warlord, was ruled ineligible because of a conviction at the International Criminal Court for alleged bribing witnesses. And the British government has apologized over what it calls the shameful way residents of the disputed Chagos Islands in the Indian Ocean were evicted from the territory about 50 years ago. However, it insisted the matter should not have been referred to the International Court of Justice. Mauritius argues that the islands are an integral to its territory. A former city trader who was jailed after losing $1.8 billion from the Swiss bank UBS has accused the UK authorities of racism after being told he faces deportation. Kweku Adoboli, who was born in Ghana but has lived in the UK since he was 12, was jailed for 7 years. Now, he says peace is the priority, but can Mali's President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta deliver? He made that promise as he was sworn in for a second term, just hours after a UN peacekeeper was injured in a rocket attack in the northern town of Menaka. Now, Mr. Keïta won 67% of the vote, a result that the opposition still disputes. So what kind of future lies ahead for Mali? Let's bring in Paul Meli from the Africa program at the Chatham House, and of course, a specialist in the Malian affairs. Paul, 5 years ago, Mr. Boubacar Keïta, he was elected in a landslide majority. And he promised to restore peace, he promised to defeat armed groups, he promised to improve the economy. Did he achieve any of this at all?
He made some progress with all of them. The recovery of the economy in some ways is the least significant in headline terms, but of course affects most ordinary Malians. And you can say that in a very difficult situation, he managed to maintain economic stability, and from, as it were, its indigenous strengths, gold mining, agriculture, the Malian economy grew, and that will support ordinary Malians. But for the really tough agenda, the peace process, he was slow to engage. And the big criticism that's been made of him both by the Malian opposition, but frankly by many international partners and many people in the wider West African region, is that he could have driven the process through with more dynamism. The fact that Mali is still wrestling with terrorism, the fact that there are still problems of instability in the center of the country, critics would say, is partly down to the lack of momentum, if you like, in his leadership.
So would you say then can he categorically say that he's in control of the country, given the large parts in the northern part of Mali that really are not under his control?
Yes, I think he can say that the Malian state is in control of most of the country. Of course, large parts of the far north are just empty desert, and it wouldn't be practical for the government to have what you might call a detailed local presence everywhere. But what's been absent is really a clear strategic vision for how he's going to, as it were, thicken up the state. And it was quite telling at his swearing in today, after he'd been sworn in, taken the oath, the Chief Justice of the Malian Supreme Court basically said, and now your job is to re-establish the presence of the Malian state and its services in all parts of the territory, obviously in all parts where people live. And the really big problem area is the center of the country, where there wasn't violence 5 years ago, but now there's an ongoing intercommunal, partly ethnic, partly jihadism conflict. And there's been one local peace deal this week, but already it's been repudiated. And that's going to be the big challenge. Can he tackle that?
All right, so very quickly, one word. If you were to speak to him, what would you advise him to do? Priority?
Peace in central Mali, and really trying to make that local peace agreement something that can spread out across the centre, because a lot of people live there. It's not like the north, it's quite densely populated, and it really matters in economic terms as well.
All right, Paul Meli, thank you for your thoughts. Thank you. This is Focus on Africa from BBC World News with me, Sophie Ikenye. Still to come, Peter has the sports news. Could Eritrea's Kudus Merawi become Africa's first cycling superstar? I'm Sophie Ikenye, and you're watching Focus on Africa from BBC World News. The top story on this program: the Africa-China summit wraps up in Beijing as the continent's leaders head home with the promises of investment and loans. Now, this week's summit in Beijing has focused attention on Africa's economic ties with China. Ethiopia has seen a lot of investment from Beijing, but the picture is very different for its neighbor Eritrea. Its economy has been badly damaged by conflict, instability, and sanctions. But could the recent peace with Ethiopia change that? Emmanuel Igunza reports from Eritrea's Red Sea coast.
Eritrea is a country full of hope for better days ahead. Decades of conflict against its neighbor Ethiopia and UN sanctions took a serious toll on the country's economy. Last year, the World Bank ranked Eritrea second from bottom in its Doing Business report, further highlighting its unattractive trade environment. The country still relies heavily on agriculture, as investors have shied away. But newfound peace with Ethiopia has marked a change. In recent weeks, hundreds of visitors arrived into Eritrea after borders and the airspace between the countries were reopened for the first time in 2 decades.
To have this opportunity is not easy for the two countries as well, because we can do a lot of business as well from here to there, and then from Addis to here as well too. It's going to be a big change.
Nowhere is the decline of the last few decades more evident than in the port city of Massawa, a once bustling commercial hub on the Red Sea. Businesses stand abandoned and the port is only partially used. Massawa is an important and strategic port city for Eritrea, but it has so much huge potential that could dramatically change the fortunes of this country and the local communities here. The potential for growth is huge. Eritrea's Red Sea coastline sits on one of the busiest shipping routes in the world. Tourist attractions are also plenty, with its more than 300 islands. And locals here are keen to turn their fortunes around.
We never been built a lot of buildings for the last, I would say, 12, 13 years. But right now, since the peace is coming with a neighbor in Ethiopia, it's going to be a very booming business, especially on real estates.
And if Eritrea does get it right, there is no shortage of big investors willing to spend their dollars here. Thousands of jobs could be created for young people who previously fled the country in their thousands, hoping for better lives in Europe. Big companies are already eyeing a piece of Eritrea's potential.
Massawa, as you know, is a very popular tourist destination, especially for scuba diving from Europe. So we, following the flight, we also intend to promote package tours from Europe and US to Massawa, Assab and Eritrea.
It is that strategic location that could prove to be Eritrea's biggest advantage in turning its fortunes around. But all this depends on the new peace deal holding. Peace that until now has proved elusive and costly for this small nation. Emmanuel Igunza, BBC News, Massawa, Eritrea.
You're watching BBC Focus on Africa. Let's find out what's happening in the world of sport. Peter.
Many thanks, Sophie. And let's begin with news that Gabon international Mario Lemina has been fined over $120,000 by a magistrate court in southern England for speeding. The 25-year-old, who was a record signing for Premier League side Southampton last season, admitted failing to tell the police if he was driving when his car was clocked speeding 3 times. He says he doesn't know if his brother or cousin were behind the wheel of the car at the time. The fine is understood to be the biggest ever given in the UK for a motoring offence. He has also been banned from driving for a year. And talking about fines, Manchester United manager Jose Mourinho has been handed 2 6-month prison sentences, both suspended, and a $2 million fine. Prosecutors allege the 55-year-old owed the Spanish state more than $3.5 million in undeclared revenue relating to image rights in 2011 and 2012, when he was in charge of Real Madrid. By agreeing to this plea deal, Mourinho is not expected to spend any time in prison. Now, cycling's Vuela Espana enters its second week from today, with Britain's Simon Yates in the lead. But Africa's Team Dimension data has also had some success in this year's race, with Benjamin King winning 2 stages, including Sunday's Stage 9. Riding alongside King is Eritrea's Kudus Merawi, seen by many as one of Africa's brightest prospects. The BBC's Isaac Fannin has more.
In Eritrea, cycling is an obsession and has long been a way of life. So imagine the reaction when, in 2015, 2 Eritreans, Daniel Tekle Haymanot and Mahawi Kudus, became the first black Africans to finish the Tour de France.
Eritrean fans, over 300 guys, they came with the flags, so it was really something special.
At just 24, Mahawi's already had a distinguished career. He's featured in all 3 of these so-called Grand Tours, the Tour de France, the Giro d'Italia, and he's currently racing in the Vuelta a España for the 4th time. But to get to this stage has been far from easy.
You have to ride in Europe to be professional, because in Europe is the highest level, not in Africa, to adapt the weather and all the technical descent mountains. So it was not easy to be professional. We've never been see snow, weather is challenge.
But Mahawi's adapted. At last year's Vuelta, he recorded one of his best results, finishing one of the stages in 2nd place, a rare feat for an African cyclist.
I always have believed myself I'm already talented, so with the features I can do really good results.
Mahawi is part of Africa's Team Dimension data, who aim to have an African winner of the Tour de France by 2020, or to have a rider wear the yellow jersey, which is worn by the overall race leader. He's integral to their plans. Eritrea hasn't had a rider in the yellow jersey yet, but in 2015, Daniel Tekle Haymanot wore the polka dot jersey, the reward for picking up the most points in the mountain stages. So how big would it be for Mahawi to one day wear that yellow jersey?
I can imagine, because Daniel, when he wore that polka dot jersey for 4 days, when he comes here to Asmara, the celebration welcome to him was super massive, like an expectation. We go to the president and we have massive celebration all the way the streets to Asmara. So if I wore that yellow jersey, I can imagine how they're gonna me celebrate in Asmara.
You know what? He's good. He's really, really good. Sophie, that's your sports.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Now, cheerleading is one of the great symbols of American culture, from high school to the big sports leagues like the NFL and NBA. But it's becoming popular now across the world and could even be part of the 2024 Summer Olympics. Now, this cheerleading team from Lagos in Nigeria told us why they love it.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7! Are you ready?
Cheerleading is not just a sport, it is a way of life. Being a cheerleader, we are the support system that helps to motivate sport teams to do their best.
Not only do we help motivate fans to take pride in their team, but to lead and demonstrate to the fans in the stand of how to show up that spirit.
1, 3, and 5, and 7, and 1, and...
It was always my dream to be a cheerleader. I thought they were always so pretty and have so much fun.
Cheerleading is not only about dancing, bright colors, and flamboyance. There is a lot of process that goes into the sport. You need to have discipline, dedication, confidence, acrobatic skills, and athleticism. And above all, team spirit.
Yeah.
I love my team because we're a family, we care for each other. Like whenever we're striking a stunt, we do it together. We do teamwork. When one person falls, all feel bad.
Even though we have our issues, we always have our backs.
Cheerleading is seen as an American culture. It is now gaining popularity in Africa and also in the world.
There's already an annual Cheerleading World Championship, which we will be part of next year.
In 3 years, the ROC will vote on whether or not to include the sport in the 2024 Summer Olympics. Let's hope the ROC give us the vote.
Well, now you know the hard work that's put into cheerleading. Well, don't forget you can get in touch with me and some of the team on Twitter. I'm at @CKenya. That's all from the program, from me and the rest of the Focus on Africa team. Thank you for your company. Bye.